Well, we're here on what I think is number 32 of our continuing commentary on Mark. Once we get through, I think today we'll be able to cover the rest of chapter 7 of Mark and possibly chapter 8. Then we'll be in chapter 9, and I think things get a little bit more dense and pick up a little bit approaching chapter 11, which is something I've studied quite a bit because of my dissertation on the so-called temple cleansing in Mark. So that'll be really kind of like the highlights till the end of the gospel, chapter 16, the first 8 verses, and then maybe we'll say something also about the longer ending of Mark. But in chapter 7, 31, he is in the region of Tyre and Sidon. So this would be outside the land of Israel, really. This would be pagan territory, Phoenicia. He crosses the Decapolis, these 10 Greek cities. And so either Jesus ventured outside of the land of Israel. Um, he does heal the Syro-Phoenician woman in Matthew. I don't see this happening in Matthew, where twice you have the injunction: don't go to the Samaritans, don't go to the pagans, just go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, which we need not take literally either. I think part of Matthew's theology or presentation of the gospel is that Jesus went to Israel, is rotundly rejected by Israel, and then, of course, at the end, he commissions the apostles to go to all the nations, etc. So whether he ventured outside the land or not, I don't know. I think it's probable he had some contacts and probably even healing experiences with non-Jews. I think in Luke with the centurion, as I recall, I mean, he heals telepathetically at a distance. He doesn't, I am not worthy that you come under my roof. And so Jesus did ingather the lost sheep of Israel, the sinners, the publicans, had these meals with them. The ingathering of the 12 tribes, represented by the 12 apostles. But it's not until Luke, the time of Acts, when what is said in Mark 7:19, which is he cleans all foods, declares all foods clean. Only later in the early church will the bold move be made to go to Gentiles. And that is narrated in Acts. And I think the graduality of the Lucan presentation in Luke Acts is probably more realistic than this abruptness of Mark, where everything is immediately, as we have said. So that here you have a very sort of earthy presentation of a healing where Jesus sticks his fingers in the ears of this deaf mute, and then with his saliva touches his tongue, something that is rather earthy, shall we say, gives a some sort of a grunt or sigh, and then says the famous Ephatha, it says here, um, or Ephatha, yeah, Ephatha without an R, and be opened. I think that this is one of these things that is commonly taken to be Aramaic, which means be opened. And then his ears were uh, opened, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly or correctly, um, orthos in Greek. So that, and then Jesus, the famous, command, tell no one, with the, again, famous non-obeyance of Jesus. The more he charged them to not tell anyone, the more zealously they proclaimed it. So we have this, so-called messianic secret, which I think is part of the Markan presentation, followed by other gospels, especially synoptics, Matthew and Luke, pretty much, where Jesus doesn't want to reveal who he really is until the very end, when the whole his life is finished. Only the narrator, as we have said, the Father, Jesus himself, and the demons know who he really is. Otherwise, people would be, um, have the wrong idea of what kind of Messiah he is. And I think we're going to see that shortly, hopefully today, with Peter's confession, where Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, and Jesus strongly tells him not to say anything, but then has to precisely announce his passion, the first announcement of his passion, wherein Peter takes him aside and says, "This must never happen to you." This is where you have this disconnect between the very unique idea that Jesus has, that he, as the Messiah, must suffer, and the common, universally held idea that the Messiah doesn't really suffer. We could explore, certain avenues where there is a suffering Messiah. There are the labor pains of the sort of begetting of the Messiah, etc. And there's allusions to that in John, a woman in labor, etc. And so that could be explored. But normally, the righteous sufferer in the Old Testament is not really the Messiah. And if you did look at Isaiah 53, the famous fourth song of the suffering servant, in the Targumic, in the Aramaic translation tradition, with commentary and elaboration, it's really the temple that is delivered. The Messiah is a teacher but doesn't suffer. So I've tried to find, along with Nickelsburg, evidence that this righteous sufferer of Psalm 22, Isaiah, even the Maskilim in Daniel, etc., the Son of Man, perhaps you could probably connect some dots there. We're not going to solve that now, but nevertheless, certainly the apostles did not expect or want Jesus to suffer, and so they all abandoned him, etc. And that is certainly a concrete historical fact. And Mark makes a lot of it with this failure to understand that the disciples have, beginning even with Peter, who does recognize Jesus to be the Messiah, but not the right kind of Messiah, which is something, an innovation that Jesus brings, that he has to suffer, as Luke explicitly says. So then you have in chapter 8 the second multiplication of the loaves. This would be a pagan or Gentile participation, multiplication of the loaves. It's kind of a lesser version of the Jewish multiplication in chapter 6. Here you have only 7 uh, baskets left over instead of 12. And it's very similar otherwise. Has compassion on the crowd. They have been away for, they have been in the desert for 3 days. They leave out here that they were like sheep without a shepherd, which appears in chapter 6. So that, this would jibe with the lost sheep of the house of Israel in Matthew. You have the idea that the Jews are without a real shepherd. Certainly, the Sadducees would not be good shepherds. The Pharisees and Jesus have tremendous differences. The Pharisees are certainly excluding these lost sheep. So if these hungry people out in the desert are lost sheep, they are without a shepherd because they have been ostracized and excluded from this ingathering that God has promised in Ezekiel 37 and in so many other passages, in which again Jesus symbolizes and enacts, incipiently, if you will, by choosing 12 disciples, including a traitor. So that you have this second multiplication of loaves. Uh, we don't need to really, say too much about it, I don't think. And then you have this interesting Pharisees ask for a sign. And if you look at the Markan version of this, Jesus basically says, no sign will be given. And so you have Mark saying no sign will be given. Matthew has two different, or maybe three different versions of this asking for a sign. In chapter 12, you have the mention of Jonah. Now, he's mentioned also in Matthew 16. No sign will be given except the sign of Jonah. And without further elaboration in Matthew 16, 4. If you go to Matthew 12, he says that no other sign, or no sign but the sign of Jonah, the prophet Jonah, will be given. And then he loads up what this sign of Jonah is. It's a double sign. As Jonah was 3 days in the belly of the big fish, so must the Son of Man be in the belly of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. Then he adds, the Ninevites will rise up in the judgment against this generation and condemn it because they converted at the preaching of Jonas. And here there is something greater than Jonah, or the queen of the south will rise up in the judgment against this generation and condemn it because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and there is something greater here than Solomon. So that whether Jesus said no sign, they'll ask for a sign after the temple cleansing, or with what authority do you do this? The Johannine version of that is what sign? Some sort of, credentialing quality or act that proves he comes from God. So you have this idea that people were testing him and asking for a sign, and there are a lot of texts about that in John chapter 2. What sign do you do this? Destroy this temple. He points to himself in John 2, and I will raise it in 3 days rather than I will build it in 3 days. They accuse him of, I will destroy this temple, says Mark. Or Matthew says, I could destroy this temple, built by human hands, and in 3 days another one not built by human hands I can build. In John is clearly Jesus is the temple, the temple of his body, and then it's raised, not built. So you see these different traditions regarding these things, and our time is coming to an end. So we didn't get nearly as far as I was maybe hoping, but we'll have to continue some other time. Thank you.